Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about the FedEx Flight 5033, which is an MD-11 that had a runway excursion in Mumbai yesterday. And I'm going to give you 3 different reasons why aircraft normally have runway excursions. Stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on right.
Clear to land, 31 right. Delta 260, Purdue.
So before we start, guys, I just want to mention a few things. So you know how I always say that I don't want to talk about ongoing investigations and I don't want to talk about things basically that I don't know anything about. So why am I now sitting here talking about something that happened yesterday? Well, the reason for that is that on this occasion we had a runway excursion, but there was no injuries, there was no damage to the aircraft, there was no damage to the airport. So I wanted to use this as an example of things that can happen, and I wanted to talk to you about this increasing safety trends in the aviation world, which is runway incursions, and what is being done about it, what we know about them. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. But just to give you some synopsis, guys, what happened yesterday was around midday in Mumbai. There was an MD-11, which is a stretch version of the DC-10, a tri-jet aircraft that came in for landing on runway 14 in Mumbai International Airport. Runway 14 is a long runway, it's 2,900 meters long, but this happened during the kind of onslaught of Cyclone Nisarga, which meant that there was quite gusty, strong crosswinds and partially tailwind for this runway, and also a varying amount of rain. So it went from light rain to heavy rain, as it does during this kind of weather phenomenon. So the aircraft comes in, does what appears to be a normal landing from all that we can see, and there is a video showing the last part of the landing roll where the MD-11 comes in. You can hear the engine noise from the thrust reversers starting to die down, and then it suddenly goes up again to full reverses, and you can see how the MD-11 is coming in kind of a cloud of water vapor and comes to a full stop after a slight left turn just before the end of the paved part of the runway. So if it stops within the paved part of the runway, why is it called a runway excursion? Well, the fact is that the runway excursion happens, or is deemed to happen, whenever you exceed the available landing distance. So even though there might be a paved safety area beyond the threshold of the runway, that is not really made to be used for landing. It's not part of the available landing distance. And if they had to roll out over that, in this case they used about 9 meters, which is about 30 feet of that area, then it's still put into the statistics as a runway excursion, even though there's nothing wrong with the aircraft, there was no holes in the runway, and no injuries, right? The aircraft came to a stop there, and it was subsequently pulled away from that position, and the runway was closed for a few hours before it opened up again. I think that the reason they closed the runway was because of the bad weather that was passing over. Right? So this is what happened, and this is kind of the visual evidence that we have. So then let's go in and talk about runway excursions. So as I mentioned, the runway excursion is when you use more than the available landing distance. It can happen during the takeoff, it can also happen during the landing, and you can also veer off the side of the runway. That's also a runway excursion. Now, runway excursions is one of those very few areas in modern aviation where the safety trend is negative. As in, we are seeing more runway excursions and not less of them. While all of the other kind of dangerous things that happens within aviation is constantly decreasing, it's becoming safer and safer, for some reason we're seeing more and more runway excursions. And there's been plenty of them during the last few years. I think there was about 130 in 2019. So why is this? Well, basically you can divide the reasons for runway excursions into 3 different areas. The first one is environmental, right? So that has to do with what kind of weather and conditions that the aircraft is coming into. So for example, yesterday we were already been talking about the winds. So on the landing here, the winds were about 0 to 0 degrees at 13, gusting 23. Okay, and if you go in and you look at the crosswind and the tailwind components there, you'll see that with the gusts you had a crosswind varying from about 13 to 20 knots straight from the side, and you have a tailwind component which is about 7 to 11 knots depending on where the gust happens. Now these are not extreme winds, they're well within the capability of a modern aircraft to do, but they do pose us challenges. The tailwind would definitely increase the needed runway distance for landing, and the crosswind will make it just a little bit more tricky. All right, but this is something that we practice all the time in the flight simulators, and actually when we land on a day-to-day operation, it's almost always a little bit of crosswind. So that's from an environmental point of view, wind. Then on top of that you have precipitation, rain. So rain, if it's just a wet runway, the way that the runway is built is that it's built kind of like this, all right? That's for the rain to be able to fall down and then quickly run off the runway so that it never really becomes a flooding issue. But of course, depending on how much it's raining, there's only so much water that can actually kind of evacuate the runway. So on a normal day-to-day basis, if it's raining, when we do our landing calculations, which we always do before we start a descent, by the way, and we see that there's a wet runway, that will have an effect on our landing distance, but it will not be that bad. It's braking action good, okay? But if there is a lot of rain coming in suddenly, well then we might have calculated our landing distance on a wet runway, but what you end up having is a flooded runway. And a flooded runway is something completely different, because if the runway is flooded, which is it's more than 3 millimeters of water on it, then there is a chance of aquaplaning. Aquaplaning can be very, very dangerous. It basically means that we're coming in, we're landing, and because of the amount of water and because of the speed we're coming in with, the tires cannot penetrate the water fully. It builds up kind of a cushion of water, and the tires are sitting kind of surfing on this cushion, and there's no braking action. All right, no matter how much we're pumping our brakes and how much pressure we put on it, because of that pillow, you're basically just skidding like you were on wet ice. Right, so aquaplaning can be a real problem with flooded runway, which is why we avoid landing on flooded runway wherever we can. Right. On top of that, you have other environmental things that can happen as well. For example, ice and snow. Obviously, that's not the case yesterday, but you can also have rubber deposits. Now, rubber deposits is a little bit trickier, right? So what tends to happen is that when we come in and land, as the wheels hit the runway, they will accelerate very quickly and they will leave a deposit of rubber on the runway, right? I've actually done a video about why you don't spin up the wheels before landing. You can check that out if you want. When it does so, that rubber deposit, if that gets wet, it becomes really, really slippery, okay? And obviously, you are going to have that deposit primarily in the touchdown zone on each runway end. So that means in the middle of the runway there's not much rubber, but in the ends there might be. That is being removed on a regular basis, but if it hasn't been done and it's a lot of rain on it, you can have an area which is almost like ice, very, very slippery. So that's also worth taking into account. All right, so that was our environmental reasons. Now, the second, and I would probably argue one of the biggest reasons that we have runway excursions, are the human factor. Okay, it's either pilot or ATC. So, what I mean by that is that the pilots, our landing technique, and the way that we do our landings is extremely important. One of the biggest reasons for runway excursions due to human factors is a landing that happens after an unstabilized approach. All right. If you don't know what an unstabilized approach is, I did a video about that last week, so you can click the link up here and get a full explanation of it. But if you're coming in and trying to land after an approach that has not been stabilized, the likelihood of you kind of getting a runway excursion is much, much higher. That's because you might be coming in at a too high angle, which results in a hard landing, which might be a bounced landing, which might lead to you eating up much more runway than you expected. Or you're coming in with too much speed, too high energy, and you end up floating. And while you're doing that, at that high speed, you're also eating a lot of runway, ending up landing maybe halfway down the runway. And now you only have half the available landing distance that you have calculated with, and you won't be able to stop. Okay, so coming in and having a stabilized approach before the landing is crucial for a safe landing. Then you have faulty landing techniques, right? I was talking a little bit about the crosswind landing technique. The fact is that as we're coming in and we're doing a crosswind landing technique, we have to, there's quite a lot of skills involved. Like you have to come in on the correct speed with the correct crab angle, and then you need to decrab during the flare, and you need to touch down in a decrab, partially with cross controls. And as you're doing that, you might be a little bit late with taking the thrust reverses just because you're so concentrated on handling. This has happened, okay? But I'd say, except for the unstabilized approach reason, the second biggest reason for runway excursions due to human factors is the inability to use our kind of braking aids, right? Our deceleration aids. And we have 3. So by far the biggest kind of deceleration aid we have is our wheel brakes. Now wheel brakes, we normally set a auto brake selection. So the brakes will automatically start being applied at a set deceleration rate on each landing. And when we've sitting, before we started approach and we've been calculating our landing distance, then we would have calculated it with a specific auto brake setting. So we set our auto brake setting, right? Now, if the auto brakes fails to work, we need to recognize that and apply manual braking. And we get notified by that in the 737, I should say, by an auto brake disarm light. Okay, that means we need to apply manual braking in order to stop. The second system that we have is our flight spoilers and our ground spoilers. These are these big panels that you see coming up on the wings of the landing. And what they do are 2 things. They add drag to the aircraft, but the biggest thing they do is they spoil the lift of the wings. So the wings are not producing any lift anymore with those things up. It means that the full weight of the aircraft falls down on the brakes, on the landing gear, which means that the brakes will become more efficient. So those 2 together is going to make the aircraft decelerate a lot. However, if you end up in a situation where you have very poor braking action due to ice or due to aquaplaning or due to rubber on the runway, well, that it doesn't really matter how much flight spoilers you have or how much wheel brakes you have, because we have an anti-skid system. The anti-skid system is there just like the kind of ABS system on your car to make sure that the wheels doesn't get stuck. If the wheels stops and they start to skid, it means that their ability to decelerate the aircraft is greatly reduced. So this anti-skid system is there, and it feels every individual wheel, and it feels when the brakes are applied. If the wheel starts to come to a stop, it releases brake pressure. Make sure that it keeps spinning, and then it reapplies. And it does these in sequences. And depending on how slippery it is, it will slow down these sequences and try to apply as much pressure as possible. But every time that this wheel comes to a stop, which it does immediately if it's really, really slippery, it will just release brake pressure. So no matter how much you try to brake this aircraft, how much you try, it doesn't matter. You're just hauling down the runway, okay? Now, that brings us to our third system, which is the thrust reverses. Now, the MD-11 has 3 engines and it has 3 thrust reverses. And the thrust reverses is going to be the only thing that will get the aircraft to stop in case you're coming in onto a very slippery situation. Now, this has been proven to be one of the biggest reasons for runway excursions during slippery runway operations. It is that the aircraft comes in, it lands, the pilots are so focused on trying to get the aircraft to the center of the runway and fight crosswinds, whatever, they forget the thrust reverses, and when they realize it is too late, it takes a while for the thrust reverses to spool up properly, and then you run off the end of the runway. Okay, so it is crucial that all 3 of these systems are being engaged as soon as you land. When you touch down, the weight on wheel switches together with the wheel spin up is going to raise the flight spoilers, right? The aircraft will now sink down onto the landing gear. The auto brake should kick in almost immediately. It takes a few seconds for it to kind of feel where it is, and then it's going to start accelerating. If not, you need to apply manual braking, and you can do that. You can override the auto brake system if you need to. And as you touch down, you select the thrust reverses, so the first interlock. That means that the thrust reverses will kind of start to deploy. And then as it's deployed and you get the green light from the reverses, you'll feel it as well. There's a mechanical lock that stops you from accelerating the reverses before they've deployed properly. And as you deploy, then you can use either the first detent on the 737 again, or which gives you about 70-ish%, or full reverse thrust, which is about 82%. Okay, and you can use reverse thrust all the way, full reverse thrust, until the aircraft is stopped. Under normal circumstances though, when you feel that you have the aircraft deceleration under control, we start to put them down to idle at around 60 knots ground speed. But you never ever take away the thrust reversers, as in stow the thrust reversers, until you are perfectly sure that you can stop the aircraft. The reason for that is because you need to. If you come into a situation where you suddenly lose braking action towards the end of the runway, for example, you might need very quick get access to the thrust reversers again. And this is important, guys. It's very important that you keep the thrust reversers open until you're down to taxi speed. Because if you think about it, if you're landing during wind drops conditions, for example, the kind of plows and the brushes and brushing cars, they will be very effective in the center, the mid part of the runway. But as they start to get close to the runway, and especially if it's slippery, they're going to start slowing down, they're going to start turning, and it means that the braking action can actually get much worse towards the runway ends, right? And also, remember we talked about the rubber deposits. There is a possibility that the rubber deposit might be there towards the end of the runway, or there might be standing water there. There might have been a rain shower that just came in locally and covered the end of the runway with standing water. And the reason I'm saying this, guys, is that if you watch this video, you can clearly hear how these guys have come in. You can hear the thrust reversers. You can also hear the thrust reversers starting to decelerate, and then all of a sudden they go up again, right? So that would be a possible indication that they have been starting to stow them, are starting to decrease the reverse thrust, because they're feeling quite confident with the deceleration, and then all of a sudden hit the brakes. They're in this area of poor braking action for whatever reason. They realize it doesn't work, and they reapply full reverse thrust, and they manage just to stop it within the paved area, right? So this is important in any condition, especially during heavy precipitation or in icing conditions, or on slippery runways for whatever reason, that you get yourself down to taxi speed and you do not cancel your reverse thrust until you're absolutely sure that you don't need it. Now these guys, they did not do that. They have the thrust reversers available to them, and that was lucky, because you can clearly see that that is what's stopping the aircraft towards the end. And the third point that I want to take up is failures, as in technical failures of the aircraft. So that would be failure of the brake system, failure of the anti-skid system, failure of the hydraulics, for example, that might decrease the amount of flight spoilers and ground spoilers that we get up on each wing. So those technical malfunctions, they can be dangerous if they happen during the landing roll, but most of the cases we know about them when we're airborne, and we take that into account when we do our landing calculations. That's all I had, guys. Runway excursions continues to be a problem. It's something that we in the industry needs to be really aware of. We need to be very careful when we do our landing distance calculations. You need to always err on the side of caution, as in if you have varying runway reports, for example, of weather reports, then take the worst weather and make sure that you have the landing distance available for that worst case scenario. Be vigilant with your landing technique. Make sure that you always fly a stabilized approach, and that you get those thrust reversers and those spoilers and those brakes working as you get down on the runway. And just be careful, guys. That's pretty much what I wanted to say with this video, because it is a statistic problem, and if you have a severe runway excursion, it is a very potentially dangerous thing to do. Okay? Guys, I guess you have questions about this. I hope that I have earned a subscription for you. If you like these kind of explanatory videos, then make sure that you've subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell so that you know when I do live streams, interviews, extra videos like this one. And also, if you like the kind of merch, these kind of t-shirts and stuff, go in and check out Teespring. There is links to it here below in the video. And right now, if you see this within an hour of the release or so, there is a 20% discount going on today. So go in and check it out. And wherever you are out there, have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Right guys, I really hope that you liked that. If you want more content like that, more aviation content, well then check this out. I hope that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell. See you inside of the Mentour Aviation app and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye bye.